Was a time of the preacher when the story begun. The choice of a woman and the love of a man, and how he loved her so dearly. He went out of his mind. Well, she left him for someone she left behind. And he cried.
Coming live.
Hey, everybody. Here we are. Good evening. Some of you right now are coming onto Facebook, or you're picking up your phones, hopefully, and coming to see things, and you're like, what is this fire stuff all about? And maybe you're watching from somewhere that is not local to Walton County, and you're like, hey, why are you in your house? Aren't you supposed to be evacuating? There's a major forest fire in Santa Rosa County that is 50 miles from here, and between here and Pensacola. There is a forest fire in Santa Rosa Beach right now, a brand new one, but not near as massive and not near as dangerous as the, I believe it's called the 5 Mile Swamp Fire, going on in Santa Rosa County right now. But we're all safe and sound, especially here in Freeport. Freeport is always safe and sound. How are you, Garrett?
I'm doing all right, man. I'm enjoying my week, my evening.
Good.
Yeah.
We're here in the little upper room studios that was nicely cleaned today because we're slobs on Sundays.
Oh, that's true. Mainly Ricky.
Well, y'all, what happens is y'all come in here and you drink my coffee and eat my food, and then when it's all over, you just go out the door.
Oh, it's true.
That's what happens. That's
I
what
hang
happens.
around. I hang around.
Yeah, you do.
I just eat more food and drink more coffee. And then I leave.
Then you leave. I try to get a beer or even something if it's late enough. So did I hear you properly? You said
Say what?
Did I hear you properly that you said this is session 6?
Yeah, session 6.
So we're 6 weeks deep into upper room stuff.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I think it's session 6.
It's got to be. You mislabeled one. And
that was last week.
Okay, it's 6. Yeah.
Yeah, because last week I played the video from the previous week.
Yep.
Session 4
Yep.
when it was 5. Now it's 6. Yeah, should be right.
All right. We had a great question this week that was posted online. I think it was on the Facebook page. Maybe it was an email. Maybe it was both. The questioner's name was Amy. And Amy said, y'all mentioned something about foundational stories in the book of Genesis. What is that all about? And I think that this idea of the foundational stories is consistent with what we've been talking about for a few weeks now. That what you start with is what you end up with. I think that's for lack of pardon the pun, the genesis of this conversation. And we talked about Abraham in Genesis, and that we leapt forward to atonement theories last week. And now we find ourselves going back to Genesis again. And I'm looking over across the table, and Garrett's got all these notes on a yellow notepad where he has been working on stuff and has questions to ask and conversations to start. But before we get to those, I'll say that when I'm speaking of foundational stories, foundational elements to our faith and where it goes, I'm talking about the first 11 chapters, and I think our dogs have just gone crazy downstairs. I don't know if folks can hear that.
Can hear that.
I hope people can. I hope you can hear that, and you can comment on it maybe in the comment sections. That's Toby and Mo. Apparently there is a stranger at the door, probably
or a lizard.
Probably just the UPS driver. Well, that's going on for a while, so all right, they're resolved. Whatever it is over now. So we're talking about the first 11 chapters of Genesis when we're talking about foundational stories. And ironically enough, that's where most controversy today about how you interpret Genesis is confined to those first 11 chapters.
Right.
You can divide Genesis roughly into 3 books, And Genesis 1 through 11 constitutes the first book, and then you pick up at Genesis 12, moving forward for the life of Abraham, and then Abraham's life comes to an end, and you pick up the life of his predecessors, or excuse me, his descendants. But Genesis 1 through 11 is that foundational piece. Genesis 1, creation story number 1. Genesis 2, creation story number 2. There are two creation accounts. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, the fall of humanity. Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Genesis 5 is more or less a genealogy, just stacking up names. Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the flood, the story of Noah. Genesis 10 is another genealogy, naming of the nations. And then Genesis 11 is the introduction to Abraham and the Tower of Babel. And one of my sons, I know you're broadcasting, but can you take a call real quick? Garrett, start with one of your conversations there.
All right, switching it over. I got to put my spiffy title up there. I just threw yours up there. So Ronnie had mentioned, we started with the Genesis story and Abraham and Isaac, and we jumped over to going from the binding of Isaac to the different atonement theories. And so jumping back into Genesis, really, when we talk about foundational stories, as Ronnie was mentioning, it's talking about the creation, it's talking about the fall, it's talking about the flood, it's talking about the Tower of Babel. And, so some of those questions that arise are, how do we come about these beliefs about these different stories? What do we believe about what they say when it comes to creation? So many of our faith beliefs really dig into and dive into the literalism of these stories. So many arguments are made about, excuse me, did God create this in 6 literal days? And then with Noah's Ark, did this really happen? Did he really build this big boat? And so I think that's a little bit of what we're going to dig into tonight. And I'm not going to dig into this just yet. We got Ronnie on the phone over here.
It's actually about the fire. I'm giving an update.
Ronnie is going to give an update about the fire as soon as he's off the phone. But just bear with us just for a moment. If you want to tag along with us, like Ronnie said, we're going to be in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. We're going to be digging into each of those different stories, what they mean, the different theories that people believe about them, and really what some of our biggest takeaways are of those. So let us know how you guys are doing. Hopefully everyone's staying safe.
Sorry about that. That is actually there has been, and I may have given erroneous information to someone who was asking about the evacuation order. There's actually an evacuation order has just been issued for parts of South Walton. And I don't have it in front of me right now, but apparently the wildfire that was growing out of control on which bayou was it? Mallet? No, not Mallet.
I couldn't tell you for sure.
Anyway, it's I know it's close to the community church of Santa Rosa Beach, in that general area over toward
Musset Bayou.
Musset Bayou. The South Walton Fire District is reporting a large wildland fire near Musset Bayou Road. Everyone is asked to avoid the area at this time, and they are issuing mandatory evacuations. Can you show that on the camera?
To yours? Yeah.
This is Seagrove. There you go. This is Seagrove looking west. So sorry to interrupt our regular scheduled broadcast, But this is a pretty big deal, and folks in that area need to pay close attention and stop listening to us if you're listening in that area, and save yourselves. Please pay close attention to that. So the person that was asking I think the person that was asking earlier about the evacuation order is in a safe location.
Yeah, I think so.
So, but others need to make. It's the apocalypse, man.
It really is.
We
have killer hornets.
Hornets,
wildfires.
Coronavirus, wildfires. There was even an outside threat of a tropical system this coming weekend out of the Gulf of Mexico.
Of course. Yeah.
So, it's
better pick up all my candy before that hits, man. All my cupcakes.
Is that your evacuation plan?
Yeah, just get all the cupcakes.
Anna Balfour says it's the Cypress Breeze community near Shunk Gully. Man, that is right in the heart of Santa Rosa Beach. Thank you, Anna. We appreciate that so much, letting us know that. Our prayers are with those folks, and just get out of harm's way. And my son, who had called me, was on his way north, and he said the evacuation traffic to get off of 98 is insane coming north on 331.
Yeah,
so.
I was driving up here when I mean, it was already a pretty big raging fire. I think at that moment when I was making my way up here around 5:10 or so.
Mm-hmm.
So I can only imagine what it's like now. So I was as you were on the phone.
You gave him an interlude there.
Yeah, I was just talking about the different theories of what we believe about Genesis and why we believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And so many questions arise, and people tend to get into arguments about
right.
The literalism of it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a conversation we had last week when we were discussing, the topic for tonight. How much, and this is digging into some of the questions now, how much of Genesis do we need to take, do we need to take literally? Because, these first 11 chapters they have some pretty wild stories. And so for the everyday reader, when you start digging into Genesis and you start reading the creation story, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel, what do we need to take away from this? Do we take these things literally? Are they meant to be poetic? When were they written? And I told people that's probably what we're going to dive into a little bit tonight, a little bit of information about each of these things. Because once you begin to understand the setting, the context, the bigger picture of what's happening in the time frame that this was written, it begins to take on a whole new view and picture and understanding.
It does. Early Christians, the first church, took a both-and approach to Genesis, meaning that there were, as there are today, well-meaning, intelligent, articulate, well-educated scholars of their time that took the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis as historical and literal.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were people with the same background, the same level of scholarly expertise, who took it as allegorical. Origen, that's Origen, early theologian in the church, believed that Genesis was, the first half of Genesis especially, was largely allegorical, and that if we didn't approach it as such, we would wander into misapplication and misinterpretation. And this is always helpful, and I think it's something that Christianity hasn't always appreciated. When we're talking about deep Hebrew text, which the Old Testament is a Hebrew text. The Old Testament is the Jewish scripture. It's the Old Testament to us as Christian scripture, but it is Hebrew scripture, and it's always wise to look at what rabbis said. And there's a famous rabbi from the Middle Ages called Maimonides. And
can you spell that?
I can, but it would take me a half an hour. Maimonides is actually buried in Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. And Maimonides, leading Middle Ages rabbi, said that wherever science and scripture conflict, that the proper interpretation is to reinterpret the scripture because truth is always revealing itself. And he took the first 11 chapters of Genesis very much as allegory. So what do we mean when we say allegory versus literalism? The literalist interpretation, and Garrett, you're probably with me on this, that's all that I was taught.
Right, yeah.
6 days of creation, seventh day God rested.
He took a siesta.
And that's just how it was. I didn't. There was no other option laid out there.
Right, 6 days.
6 days, and that
24 hours.
24-hour periods, and that works fine.
Because God had a stopwatch and,
Right, and that
clock on the
works.
wall.
That works fine if you are living in a pre-contemporary, pre-science, pre-Galileo, pre-telescope, pre-microscope, pre-nuclear microscope world. You can hold. I mean, that was the prevailing opinion to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And then it all came apart when it became possible to look into refracting glass and measure the distance of suns and stars and moons and realize, oh my God, we're not the center of the universe. That the Earth is not, it's not an Earth-centric universe. It's not even an Earth-centric galaxy. And so that's when you start to see science and modernity as a movement come into conflict with the faith of a great many Christians. You also see, as a kickback against that, really severe fundamentalism, especially in the early 1900s in North America. Mm-hmm. Science had its say. Darwin had his moment to talk about origin of species, and all the philosophy, all the science was moving in the direction of evolution, moving in the direction of natural selection, survival of the fittest, old Earth, billions of years old universe. And so suddenly you had all of this scientific information coming crashing up against the language of faith. And it had its most public battle in the Scopes monkey trial 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. 1920s, 1930s, I can't remember exactly. But it was in Dayton, Tennessee. I remember that. That's about an hour and a half from where I grew up. And the late Rachel Held Evans, who died a year ago, grew up in that town. And I think her memoir is called "Growing Up in Monkeytown," because the Scopes monkey trial continued to have a great deal of influence there. So it's not always been just this issue of, we disagree on how we interpret Genesis. It's been a heated battle at times.
Right. Yeah, and that's, you mentioned once Darwin had his field day with everything, rather than embracing, these scientific claims and changes and maybe, hey, we can approach this differently in how we interpret this and how we view things and how things really are, they dug in their heels, and instead of embracing that, they just fought back. And you see that so much even in the church today. This, you have to believe things literally and take it this way, and that's where I would say, if your faith is so concrete in so many different things, and then sooner or later something comes along to provide evidence or proof for maybe that might not be the case. That's when our foundations start to shake and crumble and fall apart.
Well, you have to hold your beliefs. It's going to sound strange. You have to hold your beliefs loosely.
Yeah.
Most of them.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to have some real core beliefs that are just non-negotiables for you. I don't think Genesis 11, what you believe about Genesis 1 through 11, has to be one of those things. A lot of mystery in Genesis chapter 11. And to take it literally requires a suspension of what we know is scientific truth.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm tipping my hand already. While I was raised to take Genesis 1 through 11 literally, I won't say I'm completely an allegorist, because I think there's something else at play there. It is an allegory, but what the allegory is teaching us can go in multiple directions from there. And I need to touch base on this real quick. We have to think about how this book we call Genesis came to be. It's in
right.
It's in the book of Moses. Moses is the traditional author, and it would be better to say that Moses is the traditional editor and collector of the oral accounts.
Right.
And even then, even then, it's not Moses alone.
Moses Malone?
Alone, not Moses Malone. You've been watching was it The Last Dance?
The Last Dance.
You've been watching that?
Goat.
Have you been watching
Oh,
it?
absolutely.
Michael Jordan stuff? I haven't seen it yet. All my boys have, but I haven't seen it yet. But the working theory for the last several hundred years has been that the Old Testament as a whole, but particularly the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, is a compilation document.
Right, yeah.
That you have source 1 and source 2 as the primary streams of tradition, and possibly even tradition 3 and 4, but certainly 1 and 2. For a long time, it was thought there are 4 traditions, and it's really weird. And people say, how do they know that? You can take the scriptures, and you can tear them apart by style. It's almost like working an algorithm, mm-hmm. and see the different strands and hear the different voices that are in there. And so, for a long time, 4 sources. Now the latest scholarship is 2.5. And so these streams are collected, and they're not formalized. They're not finally written down until the Babylonian exile.
Right, and that I think is one of the most critical pieces, because I told you this. It might have been a year ago or so that I went to Bible college. I went to grad school, and I don't recall a single time. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. I don't know. Shame on me if I wasn't. But I don't recall a single time where I was taught that, other than Moses wrote or compiled the first 5 books of the Old Testament, mm-hmm. and it was with that understanding that it was written around 1400 BCE. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until a couple years ago that I came to the understanding that no, these were actually, the oral traditions, as you mentioned, were passed along, mm-hmm. but weren't compiled and written until the Babylonian captivity. Yeah. And that's huge, because what does that mean in the context of
Great question. That's a great question. And because what the meaning that you find out is that, as is true in the Gospels, that the collectors and the writers are producing holy propaganda. Mm-hmm. They have a real theological axe to grind. So what you find in this compilation, in these multiple traditions coming together, is that the Hebrew people are attempting to hold on to their identity. They are telling a very Hebrew story of creation. They're
Right.
telling the roots of where they come from. And it's not just to hold it up as a standard against the Babylonians and eventually the Romans and all the other conquerors that they've had to hold off over the centuries. It was for the purpose of instilling it into their children.
Right.
Because once they lost their homeland and they're rootless, and once they lose their temple, which is what national life circled around, when they lost those things, they had to have something that would hold them cohesively together as a group, and it became, as we have it transmitted today, the Torah
Right.
and the Old Testament. The same thing happens when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans nearly 1,000 years later, is that rabbinical Judaism was born. The synagogue became the heartbeat of Jewish identity around a teaching school of rabbis in a community, so that you see Judaism recreate what it had once done previously.
Yeah, so given the context, all right, so the Israelite people were taken into captivity in Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And then they take their oral traditions, these events that weren't necessarily, I want to be careful in saying this, they weren't necessarily meant to be taken literally.
They weren't being communicated as we communicate a story about.
Yesterday I ate pizza.
Yeah, and on July 4th, 1776, gathering in Philadelphia, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Well, that's a date and that's a fixed time. But oral stories didn't work like that. Oral stories that are 4,000 years old.
Right.
The
So
meaning of the story was more important than the individual, complete, factual account.
yeah, and that's the question that I'm leading up to is given that and where they are, what do these stories mean in light? Because you have this, you mentioned it already, and I have it in my notes that their identity was stripped away. Everything they knew about who they were was gone, and so they compiled these oral traditions, these stories about their genesis, to give themselves in their future generations their identity. So you have this creation story, and then you have Adam and Eve, this relational God. Why is this? You have this Adam and Eve story. You have the fall, Cain and Abel. You have sin entering in. Then you have things are so bad, God sends a flood. No, and you have this progression. Why are these stories so crucial for this time frame in the context that they're in Babylon? Because you could probably get into this. The Genesis story, the flood story, is not original to
Hebrews.
the Hebrews. It was also
It's a universal story.
right.
Well, so let's think of it like this. Rather than is it already 7:00? Okay. Rather than breaking down the traditional view, let me just posit not the traditional allegorical view. Let me just tell you where I am in a curious way to look at this. Will that work?
Yeah, that works.
I don't know if is anybody still left listening. Is
Yeah.
it just us? All right.
Yeah.
Before Abraham shows up on the scene in late Genesis chapter 11, what's the last thing that takes place?
Yeah, the disbursement.
The building,
Even- yeah.
building of the Tower of what?
Babel, confusion.
Babel. What is the root word for the empire in which the Jews found themselves when they were compiling the Old Testament? Babylon.
I was going to guess that, but you took it
Babylonia.
out of my mouth.
This is not a coincidence.
Right.
So here is a very Hebrew view of the allegory that is Genesis 1 through 11. The world is created by God.
Point. Yeah.
Point. There's no argument or dickering about was it 24-hour period. It's obvious that it can't be 24-hour periods because light is created before the sun is created.
You just shook a lot of people's faith
I know,
right there.
but there's no way because light is created before there's even sunlight. And the evening and the morning were the first day. It's not even possible. So it's obviously that we're dealing. And I'm just talking about literal. If you're going to go literal, you have to go literal.
Yeah.
So I'm just talking about the poetic language that is there. So God creates all that is in this creation account. We have two creation accounts. The two traditions from which they are drawing are being pulled together. Genesis 1 is a creation account. Genesis 2 is a creation account. So the Hebrew scholars, the Hebrew scribes, rather than choosing one or the other, keeps them both because they're both a part of the storytelling of their nation.
Mm-hmm.
So they keep them. So then we get to the fall. Adam and Eve, man and woman, their emergence from the garden. It is their waywardness, their sin. They choose slavery. Does that sound familiar to the Jewish story? They choose slavery to sin because they give up their trust and love of God. So they have these two boys, Cain and Abel. And Cain kills Abel. So there are these two sons, and one is right and one is rejected. That's Isaac and Jacob.
Yeah,
That's
you see that
Edom and Israel.
throughout.
That's Egypt and Israel. That's okay. So God has made a selection of the shepherd, the Israeli people. That's their theme. God has made his choice. Abel is killed. They are suffering. They are afflicted. They are persecuted. And then you come to the flood, this great washing away. What is the flood in the Jewish mindset? It is nothing less than the Babylonian captivity. The entire world, our world, has been washed away. And only this little remnant survives on this island. And where does the ark land, Garrett? Mount Ararat, in the heart of the Babylonian Empire.
Yeah, right.
Safe and sound above the waters. And then from there, God recreates the nation. And then you come to the Tower of Babel. And at the Tower of Babel, what you see is emerging civilization taking place. And how out of all of these nations and out of all these different tribes and tongues, God speaks to Abraham. And the story begins anew. That's Genesis 1 through 11. If you understand when and where, not just when, but where it is composed.
Yeah, that's the critical piece, I think. Yeah, and just what's amazing too through these chapters, you see, lurking just beneath the surface. And this is another point. I think I pointed this out a couple different times now that when you open the Bible and you just read and you read the stories for what they are, you can sometimes miss the bigger picture taking place, which is, lurking beneath the surface is this idea of pride and selfishness and sin. What led the Israelites to Babylonian captivity? What got them there in the first place? Then you have this Genesis story of pride and arrogance is the downfall of man.
Always. And so you say, oh, well, that just tears apart, Christian theology. No, it doesn't. Because Christian theology lays its theology alongside this same story. And so if you go to the purely allegorical interpretation, humanity has lost its way. Humanity has willfully defied God. And what has been the result of that? Trouble. It's a couple of weeks ago on Sunday, I talked about Pandora's box, how that was the Greek understanding of how evil comes into the world. The Christian understanding of evil, the Jewish understanding of evil is that it is a willful decision made by humanity. That is the source of evil.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't explain everything, because how do you explain a forest fire right now that's raging through our community, or a hurricane, or a pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't explain everything. But if you're looking for evil, look within your own heart is the point. And within Christian theology, we latched onto this original sin with the fall. That's when, to Amy's original question about these foundational stories, this is one of them. The Jewish people and the Greek Orthodox Church, this idea that we have sinned and thus we are totally and completely depraved, that sin, like a genetic marker, is passed on. In the Jewish and Orthodox view, they don't buy that. Catholics and Protestants do. And so their view is a little bit different. They admit that it's a disaster. They admit that it is a fall, but they don't necessarily say that humanity has fallen as far as Catholicism and the magisterial reformers say that they fell. So it depends on which one of those you're going to pick up and run with. Depends upon where your theology goes from there too.
Okay, so coming from our traditions, we said from the get-go that we come from the traditions that we looked at these stories literally. So for the listeners out there now who might look at these stories as Adam and Eve were real people, and Noah and the ark were that happened. It took them 100 years to build the ark. What would you say to these individuals, regarding this as their perspective on, this helps them in their faith? I mean, what would you add to that, or I'm going where I'm going.
How am I able to give up the literal belief in these things and maintain the faith that I have had?
Right.
I'll say it this way. If you give up the literal meaning of these things, you will not maintain the faith that you have had. And that's okay. Your faith will not collapse. Your faith will not disappear. Your faith will not be diminished. Your faith will grow. Because it will send you back to the Scriptures, looking and searching in a different way than you've ever looked and searched previously.
Yeah.
And you'll find that if you really want to talk to people about how important your faith is, that this is going to be one of the... If I can't believe in a God who murders his own son is objection number one, then you believe that mumbo jumbo about 6-day creation is stumbling number two.
Yeah.
And it will actually enable you to engage non-believers and different believers in a way that you've never been able to gauge them before, and still be very strong in your convictions. Because here's the difference between the pure Darwinist and maybe you or me, is that we can get our arms around scientific theory and hypothesis, an old Earth, a billions years old universe. That doesn't bother. It used to bother me. It doesn't bother me at all, because I maintain a faith in the source of that old universe.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That the Hebrew scriptures are correct, that God is the creator.
So yeah, I guess that kind of narrows down really the final question of what is, so if we're not meant to take this literally, and really for the Israelite people stuck in captivity, we recognize, this was compiled for them to show them pride was our downfall and pride will be our downfall. We have to, when we look at these stories, we recognize the sinful nature of man in each of these, which is arrogance and the pride, once they seep into the heart and the soul, that's when it leads us to, the worst possible, outcome. So for us today, looking back at these stories and understanding that context now, what's the point for us looking back? Is it the same for the readers of that time, for the listeners of that time? What approach can we give to that?
It's ongoing, and it's unwinding, and I think that it does reveal the danger of settling on this is the absolute only way to believe. Mm-hmm. How foolish that can become. So I'm of the school of thought that real faith has to grow. It has to change. And that sounds so squishy to people that have this foundational approach. And by foundationalism, I mean foundationalism is a philosophical approach, and a lot of people have it whether they realize it or not. Mm-hmm. So here are all my tenets of my faith, and they're like all these little bricks that build this foundation. So if I pull one brick out, it's like Legos. The whole thing's going to fall. So I have to defend every single little brick.
Yeah.
No, you don't. Because belief is much more like a web. And a spider weaves a web, and you can lose 1 or 2 points, and the web will hold while you're creating the other stanchion for it to connect to.
Right. And I think that's huge. That's been a help for me too in my faith journey. I've told you this before. One of the most helpful tools that I've had in my arsenal is very much that same approach, which is, when I approach faith, I don't want to build things, as you mentioned, like a block wall where if I come across something such as the Genesis story and I go, oh wow, I didn't recognize that about the Babylonian captivity, and that's really when things were compiled. I thought it was compiled by Moses in 1400 BCE. If that were a block theory in my faith, it just got weakened. But yeah, taking, like you said, the web approach, for me it's the trampoline. Take out a spring, examine it, look at it, twist it.
Right.
You can still bounce and have fun with this thing. And really, it's not like you're, discarding that spring. You're just putting a different spring back in its place.
And you know what? You might have to be careful jumping on it while you're replacing springs.
Right. No more backflips.
Because a faith under metamorphosis is a delicate thing.
Yeah.
It's a very delicate thing. This is something that Janet Hagberg talks about in Formations of Faith. She uses Fowler's stages of growth and talks about how and I'm a real fan of her work and her approach, about how we're all working through these stages of faith, but they're not really like steps. They're like cycles, like the seasons of a year. Mm-hmm. They're going to come back around. And she says you move to conversion, you have a faith experience, a belief in Christ. From conversion, you move to a sort of discipleship, growth. You buy a lot of books, go to a lot of trainings.
We should have put it in a plug. Buy your books.
Right? Yes, please buy my book.
Please buy Ronnie's books.
And then you go into a discipleship. Then you go to a service, and you're out there. You've learned enough to really help others. And she's convinced that 95% of churches take people to service and take them no further. But she says that's halfway.
Yep.
At some point in the life of service, you come to a stage that she calls crisis, and it's the stage of hitting the wall. And it's a lot about, it can be spurred by a lot of different things. Usually a crisis in the sense that something has upset your normal life, but it can be intellectual, it can be philosophical, it can be emotional, it can be suffering a terrible loss, it can be facing questions for which you have no easy answers. And at the wall, you slam the wall, and all the pieces fall off. it's like a stock car going into the wall. It just flies to pieces. And when that happens, you have one of three choices. You stop and you sit beside the road and you really don't know what to do with it, so you're just paralyzed. You don't really want to put things back together, but you don't know what to do. So you get paralyzed. Other people fall back and go into agnosticism and atheism. They lose their faith. And then others put the pieces back together on the other side of the wall, and the faith is nothing like what they had previously. Oh, the elements are still there, but they've had to reconstruct it in a different way. And then they can move on to what she calls the life of love. Because once you're able to let go of your faith constructions, you're open up to the genuine spirit and love of God to come fill up the empty spaces that you had filled in with your theories.
Yeah, that's great.
And then she says, that's like being converted.
All over again.
All over again. And then you start
Reconversion.
again. Yeah,
I like it.
Start again.
And this sort of gets back into something it's almost like a staple in our conversations, which is just simply this: when we dive into the Bible, when we dive into reading it and studying it, it's just incredibly important to not just simply read it, but to be a good student, to be a good scholar, to really look at the context of what's written there and why it was written. And, that's going to be one of the most beneficial things, for any person, listening. When you open up that Bible, I mean, it's crazy, just coming to the forefront of my mind, how often it's used, misused, mistreated, for a lot of just different purposes. Mm-hmm. And a lot of arguments have been made about the literalism of the text when they were never meant to be taken literally, or things taken out of context to prove a political point or push an agenda. So when you open it up, one of the most important key pieces is understanding the greater picture of what's written, why it was written.
Right. That
context is so huge, because when you look at this Genesis story in light of everything we've discussed, it changes it. I mean, like you said, the foundational pieces are still there; those don't change, but the way we view it changes.
And there are people that would say to me, because of what I've said, and I'll hear from these people. They may not comment on the Facebook page, and I can't see it if they do, but they may email me or text me or what have you. And I know the accusation, it's been leveled at me a lot, is that you're taking the Bible too lightly. This is God's inspired, infallible, inerrant word. I'll save all those I words I just mentioned for another Wednesday night session, but the point being that somehow I've disrespected the Bible by looking at it a little bit different. And my response is always, no, I think we disrespect the Bible more when we literalize it and restrict it.
Absolutely.
And narrow it. Because it truly is sharper than any two-edged sword, in the sense that it's a dangerous thing. Not in a bad way, but if it runs loose in your life and you get to dive into things like this, it's a revolutionary of thought about what's actually going on in the text. That this text was never, ever written as your basic instructions before leaving Earth. Bible. It was never written.
Your eternal life insurance.
It was never written in that context. It was written to communicate this marvelous redemptive story that begins and is as old as time itself, of which God is still working in humanity's lives.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this is actually a kind of a crucial point too that we sort of missed. I think we just briefly touched upon it, but yeah, really, this Genesis story too was super, super, super progressive. And
yeah.
because you have this God creating man and having a relationship with man was mind blowing. We talked about Abraham and Isaac and what was happening in that context, in what was surrounding that.
Right.
So now you have,
and again, let's remember the placement. This is being collected probably in Babylon.
yeah,
And so the Babylonian gods are, these bloodthirsty sons of bitches, and they can't be appeased, and they're and you see flashes of that in the Old Testament. And then you bring in this Persian element of the fiery judgment, and then you bring in this budding Greek element of the gods, Zeus and Apollo, that created and then just checked out.
yeah,
And they're really disgusted with humanity. They're not interested in humanity at all. And then the Hebrew God is this God who likes the wrestling match with his creation. This God gets involved. Not, and again, think about that again, not in literal terms as much as it is allegorical and metaphorical
God's
terms.
not putting on a singlet.
Right, that's right. And it'd be worth saying that, even our human understanding and human use of God, and it's probably important to say this as Mother's Day is approaching, God doesn't use the men's restroom. We're not talking about God as, I don't know if I should say this. We don't talk about as if God has genitalia. God is God.
Right.
Now, we view God as Father. We view God often in that male mindset. But if God's created humans in his image, he created male and female.
Mm-hmm.
So all that is somehow contained within the creative mind of God.
Right.
And now we're really talking about creation and linking it to John 1 and Colossians 1 and Ephesians 1, where you're talking about Christ being the ultimate fulfillment of all that is, and that it is the Christ that holds everything together. That's the Christian take on Genesis 1.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother, what time is it?
Yeah, we don't
we don't even have,
we don't have time.
Can't even
We don't have
introduce
time for
that.
that.
Can't even introduce that right now.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Yeah, I think the beautiful thing that you just touched upon too, being mindful of how we handle this and take this and interpret it and use it and utilize it. And one of the most beautiful imageries I get in my mind too is that when we, as you said, when you read things literally, it transforms the way that you view it, but it gives you, like you said, a very boxed in, narrow,
Right.
View of what this. It's like looking out this window right here. You guys can't see it, but you only get a certain perspective. You can only see so much of what's happening outside. You step outside this window. There you go. Let me switch cameras here. So that, when you look out that window, you see trees, you see leaves, you see needles from the pine trees, you see the deck, you see the water. But that's all you see. I mean, so when you step outside that door, it takes on a whole new perspective. You have a 360 view because now you can turn. Now you can look at things and re-examine things. And that's the way the Bible is meant to be looked at.
And I'm definitely not saying I'm right.
It's okay if you are.
to especially on a passage so mysterious and as rich in interpretations as Genesis 1 through 11. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm saying that there are multiple ways of looking at this text that beautifies and sets the text free rather than restricts it. That's what I'm saying.
Right. And, we only have a couple minutes, but it's just like a guy at a church I was at a number of years ago. Always wanted to know what my view and perspective was of Revelation. What was going to, and it's funny because the way I've always approached these mysterious books is, looking at Genesis. All right, for example, were Adam and Eve real? I think that's not even the main point. It's not even a sub point. It's so far down. Noah in the ark. Did that really happen? I wasn't there. I have no idea. Is that the point of the story that Adam got, Noah got all these animals on the ark, and I don't think that's the point. Mm-hmm. So, it's looking at these things as, what is that bigger picture in the way that we view it, and how does it enhance the story? Well, we get a clear picture now when we talk about the compilation of this and what it was meant for, and what that meant to the people in exile. Right. That they are dearly loved, that God created them, and hey, your own stupidity got you here in the first place. And
then at the same time, there's a God still there.
Yeah.
And there's a God that is somehow, some way, hoping against all hope, still working out the promises. Because
absolutely,
that's, the culmination of Genesis 1 through 11 is Genesis 12.
Yeah.
Where God calls Abraham and establishes the covenant. So all that is prelude to God being a promise-making God. That's where all that was going. That's what sustains people in exile. And that's why it was collected when it did.
And what's funny is we don't have this set out schedule about, this is what we're going to be talking about. It's really week by week, and it's really based on your guys' questions, but maybe a good question as a follow-up is what happens next.
So, Lord have mercy.
What happens next? You have the story. You have the Israelites in captivity. So the following story, story continues beyond captivity.
Yeah. We'll pick up on our own, or you fire your questions to us, okay? We're happy to. We're not answering them, but we're talking about them, and it's a lot of fun. It's a whole lot of fun, and my phone is just bouncing off everywhere from folks on the south side. This fire is really bad, so our hearts and our prayers go with you. My son is reporting that they've had some houses lost already down there, so it looks like it's on both sides of Highway 98.
Yeah, Erin sent me a text of a video where she said it jumped across 98. Just crazy.
Well, our prayers are with y'all tonight, and we're praying for the best. Please get out of harm's way. And our first responders who have already been under so much pressure in recent days, let's try to love on them and support them. We'll be back right here in this little upper room at 10 o'clock on Sunday. Thanks, Garrett.
You're welcome.
No, thanks, Ronnie, because yours is important part of this Wednesday night stuff.
Thanks, Ronnie.
You're doing a great job, and Garrett, the production on Sundays is just fantastic, and we tip my hat to Garrett and Bobby especially for making that happen. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you Sunday.
Was a time of the preacher when a story begun. Choice of a woman and the love of a man, and how he loved her so dearly. He went out of his mind. Well, she left him for someone she left behind.